Hey, everybody, welcome to Digging Deeper.
Yes.
I am here, Pete Goodman with Robert Pedroza.
What's up, everybody?
And we are digging deeper into this week's message that you gave and just talking about all things Word of God, Scripture, and the new series. So it's going to be fun conversation. Meltdown. So before we dive into the new series, we just celebrated our 10th birthday. And our last Digging Deeper episode we recorded before it actually happened because Kyle Hildebrand was in town and we wanted to get it done, but didn't really get a chance to talk too much. So we're a week out. How'd you feel about the 10th birthday? Like, was it?
Man, it was so good. I don't know about you, but it was so good to remember, to reminisce, to celebrate all that God has done in the first 10 years. It was really fun seeing some old faces and getting to see some old friends and people that you've done ministry with and seeing God use in some significant ways. And I don't know about you, but I just felt this sense and this kind of this buzzing undertone of like, man, this is what God has done. And it's almost like this is a launch pad for what I believe God is going to do. And so I walked away from that just, as much as I was celebrating and grateful for all that God has done, that ringtone, if you will, of the best is yet to come has not left my head. And I've just kept on looking forward and just dreaming ahead because I really do believe, like, it's not just a slogan. I believe 100% the best is yet to come. And I think that in our church right now, I think there are a bunch of kind of mini movements that are happening. And I think that it's really kind of the beginning of something new, of something fresh, of a new move of God that's going to really take what I think God has done and gathering some people here at Rice City Church, discipling them and helping them grow and raise up in the goodness of God. And now we're starting to see kind of a mini movement of people getting discipled or rooted. We're starting to see some movements happening in our youth ministries. And I think that it's really kind of getting ready to launch out in a really big way to help mobilize people to really start to impact the world around us. And so, I mean, I know I'm speaking.
So you were excited, is the short.
Pete is smirking at me the entire time that I'm like pouring my heart out, like excited about this whole thing. Yes, I am excited.
I love it.
I am
You're the
pumped about
easiest
it.
person to do a podcast with because I just ask one question, like, what are you excited about? And you just go, and I'm like, all right, here we go.
He goes, he's excited about something, but I am pumped about it. It was such a sweet time. I mean, it was also just fun. I don't know about you, but I had fun.
It was fun. Yeah.
I was tired by the end of it. My goodness, I was delirious.
It's a long day.
But I just had a blast. Like the park party was so good. And
was there any part of it that was weird? Like, given that we're celebrating these things have gone, and you feel like you're part of the family, but it's only been 2 years,
a little over 2 years now. Yeah.
Was it kind of like, was it weird or was it cool? Like, what was it like celebrating all these things that maybe you weren't quite a part of?
Yeah, the honest truth is both.
Yeah.
I've been here for like 2+ years, and for that first month, I would say I kind of felt a little bit like the new guy, like the outsider a little bit, and maybe even more than the first month, but it was like kind of like everyone was talking about all these stories and all these people that I was like, who's Chad? Okay. But, Chad, by the way, if you don't know, is the guy who was kind of the Swiss Army knife when the church got planted, but he did a lot of the graphic design and kind of the branding of Rice City Church and those kind of things. But, people would talk about all these people that I'm like, who do I get to meet these people? And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, this is weird. And so, kind of on the 10th birthday celebration, it kind of became that again. And so I kind of felt a little bit on the outside all of a sudden again. And so that felt kind of weird. But at the same time, I think being able to have the perspective of knowing, I wasn't here for a lot of that and wasn't part of all that, but you can still recognize that God did something special. And it's actually laid a foundation for where we're at right now. Yeah. And so I'm blessed. I'm excited. There's your favorite word.
There it is.
To be here now and to see what God's doing, to be part of it. And I'm grateful for what God has done through some of those people that I got to meet some of them for the first time last weekend as well.
It was cool.
Yeah, what's cool about you?
Completely side note, but there is another completely brand new face actually in our room right now.
There is.
Mr. You can't see him on the camera. Mr. Dawson Pila has joined our worship staff. So he's nodding with his headphones on.
Yeah, he looks cool.
Those of you that are watching and listening, you have no idea, but we're excited about that. So more new faces all the time. It's cool.
Ben's twins. Okay, don't forget those. So Ben has new twin baby leaders. Boys. Oh, future worship leaders.
He's going to worship next week. Play guitar with both of them, holding both of them. So it's going to be exciting.
I am excited for that.
He
says they have pipes.
They're loud. Yeah.
So, which I don't know if that's a new instrument or what he's mentioning by that, but either way.
Cool. Well, let's, so after the 10th birthday, we used it sort of as an end to the last series, and then we're kicking off something new.
Yes,
we did already yesterday. We're filming this on Monday. A new series called Meltdown. Mm-hmm. So what is the whole concept of Meltdown? What are we doing here?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you know this, Pete, but humanity and its frailty will sometimes, not all the time, but oftentimes have meltdowns, right? Well, we kind of lose it. And whether those things look huge or whether they look small, we have meltdowns. We're susceptible to the circumstances and we can have a meltdown.
Like when I pour a whole bowl of cereal and I open the fridge and my kids have used up all the milk, and then I throw the bowl of cereal at the wall and tear my clothes, that kind of thing?
That would be classified as a meltdown.
Okay, that didn't happen this morning, I promise.
Also, something that is very alarming and might require some extensive therapy. But,
my dog did recover after I kicked him out of it.
Okay, well, this is getting real weird. Okay, but those are meltdowns. Great examples. Examples. Those are hypothetical examples, I'm pretty sure.
Hypothetical.
Okay? But those are meltdowns. But those meltdowns aren't anything that are new to humanity. As a matter of fact, you can see them all the way back in the Old Testament. So we're going to actually look at a bunch of stories, not a bunch, but at least a handful of stories. Yeah. Stories of individuals from the Old Testament that experienced meltdowns, but not just meltdowns, because God is faithful. And we get to see also God's faithfulness in the aftermath of the meltdown, but also maybe even find some principles that we can take away, and maybe they'll be like warnings or maybe they'll be encouragements, but really look at the meltdowns that we find in the Old Testament and then see what we can really gain from it for our own lives today. Right. So that's what it's about.
So starting this Sunday and then over the next few weeks, it'll all be stories of Old Testament figures, popular people that.
Yep.
So you started off very early in the beginning with the story of Abraham.
Yeah.
Who was given a promise, and the promise, there were a lot of P's yesterday in your message. A lot of promises and problems and
priorities,
productivities. And, but he was given a promise, and the heartbeat of your message was, God said, "This is going to happen. I'm going to do this. It's going to be good." But another big P word, he didn't have patience to wait for God and tried to make it happen himself. Ends up having a son with his wife's handmaiden, and that leads to problems.
Yep.
So as we get started, like, what part of this message, it was obvious to anyone sitting in the room that this message was something that was coming from a place of, there's something personal in it. You could just tell. I can tell when someone's preaching. It's like, what this person is saying right now means something to them. Where was this message coming from you in your own life?
All three of those points. Like literally, like when I talked about the promise and how some people feel like they haven't received a promise yet, and they maybe fall into the comparison trap, and they'll look at other people and look at their lives and say their lives are filled with so much promise and things are coming easier and things like that. Like that was probably me early on, maybe even now, I don't know, in some ways when insecurity fuels those things. And I start to believe that, the lies, that the promises of God aren't necessarily applicable to me, maybe not like, I'm aware of it in an intellectual way, but sometimes it kind of permeates my thinking below the surface. You know what I'm talking about? And so I think that that's true, where I've struggled in my life to really grasp a hold of the promises of God, not because of who I think God is, but sometimes because of the insecurity of how I feel and who I feel I am. And so that has been a struggle for me as I've grown in my relationship with God. Like I'm at a place now where I've found a lot of security and identity in Jesus Christ. But that was a pathway for me. And if people know my story, I dealt with a whole lot of abuse as a child, and a lot of that was verbal, and a lot of it was very belittling, a lot, almost every day, and for the majority of the day at home. And so a lot of that pours into it, and I don't want to get too therapeutic on this, but a lot of those things really formed or malformed me and made it really hard for me to accept the promises for myself. And so on that level, it was very personal. And much of my salvation when I turned 17 and really grabbed a hold of the gospel of Jesus Christ for me, and when I started to walk with Jesus and start to step into calling and all those different things, a lot of that was really starting to grasp a hold of the promises that God had for me and really like own them, not in a selfish way or a self-centered way, but own them in a way that I'm placing my identity in the hands of Jesus and letting him tell me who I am and what he's promised me. And so that was a personal thing for me. Also, patience has always been hard for me. I don't know if you know this, Pete, and I know you guys joked last time I was on Digging Deeper, but I'm a little bit of a dreamer. I'm a little bit of a guy who walks around with a picture in my head of something that hasn't happened yet all the time, which is infuriating sometimes and requires a lot of patience, but it is a special type of patience that is required when you have a picture of something that you're moving toward in your head that's not there yet, and then there's amount of time that is more than you expected or that you planned for. Then it starts to disrupt your ability to have patience. And I've experienced that a lot in my life, where I have a dream and God has shown me something, or I have a vision for something or a thought about something, and I want to step into it, or I feel like a burning passion for something inside of my bones, and I want to get going on it, and everyone else around me is like, no, and so or God himself is saying, wait. Slow down, wait on me. And so patience has always been a struggle for me. And oftentimes, my mom says this a lot of times to me. She says that her prayer for me is that I would walk with God and not try to run ahead of him. And so a lot of times I will find myself trying to run ahead of where God wants me to walk. And God's like, no, my timing is best. My timing is perfect. You need to learn how to trust it. And so this is something that I presently have a hard time with. Like, patience is a problem for me. And in the past, when I have not submitted my life to God, submitted my timeline to God, submitted my dreams, my visions, my relationships to God, it has created problems. And I shared a very specific and a very personal problem that was created when my wife and I ended up having sex before we were married. And so that was just one example, but there's a bunch of examples that I could go through that are mostly about like dreams that I've tried to make happen before the time that it was supposed to, or things that I try to push, or, even a position that I try to push myself into, those types of things all the time. Patience has been hard for me. And when I disrupt that and disobey that, it's created problems.
Have you seen, like, that was a really, I appreciate you sharing that example. Have there been situations like that, like maybe like in ministry or as your role working in a church, where maybe you've kind of gotten ahead of God a little bit or tried to do something, and it was like you had an idea, but it wasn't God's time, and maybe it led to some problems, and you can think of anything like that?
Yeah, I actually, it's funny. I still have like a vision for like this idea of, I think that we're on the cusp right now, and we've talked about this, you and I, before, but I think that there is becoming opportunities for new and innovative, probably not innovative, it's probably just repeating or returning back to what it originally was, but really kind of getting back to different models of even how we do church, or how we kind of engage and gather together for the ministry and for the mission of Jesus. And so I actually started to like move on one of these visions that I had at one point, and I started to like push. I even started getting like a board together, and we started to like, apply for like, what do you call it? Like 501c3s and stuff like that. And we started to get the ball rolling in all these different ways. And I realized very quickly as the ball started rolling that it just wasn't ready. And I wasn't ready, and it wasn't the right time. And I will tell you that it is always a little bit embarrassing, but it's also never too late to be obedient, even if there's consequences. The further you get into it, the harder it is, and the more consequences that pile up. Yeah. But I realized as we're going in there, we had like probably 3 or 4 meetings with this board that was forming, and it was like this thing that was starting to take shape, and I just knew, and I had this feeling in my gut, and I knew God was speaking to me and telling me to slow down and to wait, and it wasn't time yet. And I kept wanting to push it because I wanted it to happen. And I learned a valuable lesson there. And I learned that I need to make sure to not make my visions trump what God is calling. And oftentimes I think God will give us a vision and I will turn it into my own idea. And I have found that in my own life where I will take a hold of something that God gives me as a dream, as a vision, as even an idea or an inspiration, and then I'll make it mine instead of actually keeping my hands open to the Lord and trusting him with it. And so that was a circumstance where I started to run, and then it got really embarrassing as things went on, and I realized, man, the funding that's going to take, the amount of people it's going to require to start to gather at this point, I just didn't have the margin. I didn't have the time. And I knew that even everyone else on the board was starting to wonder, how is this really going to work? And I knew more than anything that God was telling me to wait, and I was trying to rush. And so, that was probably a really tangible example for me. There's been multiple examples where I have tried to just kind of take the hill and start ministries and start gathering people, and it happens. But then when it happens, when you're not in the position, in the positional authority to like sustain that, then you can actually create sideways energy for an entire ministry. And I've done that before. I confess that, and I'm embarrassed to say, but I've done that to the point where I think that God was doing something impactful in churches that I was on staff with. However, it ended up being sideways energy that actually took away from the whole direction of the church. And so that's something that I've learned as I've grown and matured as well, and am still learning. Yeah. How about you? Have you ever experienced anything like that?
No.
No? Nothing at all? Come on. What do you mean, no? Okay.
I think we all have.
Okay.
I think patience is hard for everybody. I think some of the most painful things in my life have been relationally, especially as you think back to being like single and things like that, of like feeling like God made promises to me about spouses, or you even mentioned that in your message, and being like, well, maybe it's this person, and you start making decisions that you're like, I know this isn't God's timing, and it always ends up painfully.
Yeah.
And so I think the interesting thing you were even saying there at the end about starting things that even look like they were working, but actually caused trouble. And it's not quite the exact parallel, but the thing about Abraham is he has this other child, and his other child becomes, by any metric or understanding of the ancient world, successful. He becomes the father of a great nation.
Yeah.
Like, he really does.
Nations and stuff.
Yeah. But at the same time, his nation ends up being at war with God's chosen people, the Israelites, for the rest of human history, including today, as we're still seeing even in the Middle East. As you kind of mentioned in your message, Muhammad claims to be a descendant of Ishmael, and so the Islamic people believe that they are real children of the promise, because Ishmael is the older son.
He's the firstborn of Abraham.
Yeah, so Jews and Muslims have been fighting for 3,500 years. So it's like that's obviously a huge, big picture example of problems, but I think that's so to see it through the lens of, oftentimes we think about God's promises and like, I want good things, I want something good to happen, I need to wait for it. We don't always think about the other side, that not waiting on God can have serious consequences.
Yes.
Like serious consequences.
And sometimes it's just a small disobedience.
Yeah.
Like if you look even like, we look at it now and we're like, that was scandalous what Abraham did. He Sarah brought her Egyptian slave and said, sleep with my slave. And
scandalous to us, not scandalous to them.
Yeah, it seems so scandalous, but really it was actually just a small twist of the promise.
Yeah.
The promise was made to Abraham that Sarah was gonna bear him a son, right? And so he goes and the promise is a little bit of a half promise, is what he experienced with Ishmael, where it was like, it's still a son born of Abraham. It's just not with the right woman,
right?
Not from the whole picture. And so sometimes I think what we can do is we can hear a promise of God, And we can take half of it that sounds convenient and plausible in our current circumstance, and we can force that part to happen. And really what it does is it rips us off from the big picture of what God's trying to give us and what he's trying to bless us with. And then when we experience and take what is not God's best, sometimes it turns into the world's worst.
Yeah, creates real problems.
It creates real problems. And we're seeing that today.
Yeah, I had a seminary professor tell me, our whole class, I remember once, that I think he was quoting somebody else, maybe Oz Guinness, that every person that God calls to leadership will be tested to whether or not they'll wait and will rely on God's patience.
Wow, that's good.
And I was thinking, even like, you look at, if you just even, like, so Abraham is kind of the first picture of it, I guess, but it continues. I think you have this really perfect example of King David, who gets the promise that you're going to be king.
Yeah.
And then there's this moment where he's running for his life, and Saul comes into his cave where he's hiding and to go to the bathroom, and David could have killed him and taken the kingship. But David says, no, it's not. I'm waiting on God. This isn't how it's going to happen. But then you have, after David, all these kings who don't want to wait on God, and, oh, this army's coming, I'll bow down to your gods. And it's this constant tension of, will I wait? Will I trust? And it culminates in Jesus. There's this moment where Satan comes to Jesus and says, I know what you came for. You came to be king over everything. I'll just give it to you. Here's the promise. Here's what you've been promised. Kingship, lordship.
That's good.
The whole world. It's you. I'll give it to you right now. Easy.
Yes.
You can have it right now. You don't have to wait for it.
It's a shortcut.
Shortcut, no pain, no cross. Just, I'll give it to you right now. And the faithful king of Israel says, no, I'm going to be patient even if it's suffering and painful, because that's God's plan.
Yeah.
And it's like, to look at that in our own lives and say, even if it's painful, even if I have to wait, and you mentioned Hebrews 11, even if I don't see it in my own life,
Yes.
I'm going to wait on God because it's going to be better.
That's right.
That's hard. That's really tough.
You know, what's crazy though about all those examples that you brought up is it's actually the opposition. I think that we think that open doors are like or where things start to happen and where things start to shine. But when you look at, like, for example, the life of David, like, we don't like regard David as this great example and this spiritual giant because he sat on the throne. It's because he slayed a giant. It's because he, endured the desert and then ended up like pouring his heart out into some of these Psalms and things like that too. It's because he stayed faithful even after, he made mistakes and things like that too. Yeah. It's not exactly what he did when he was in the position. And sometimes I think that we think, once I'm in the promise, that's when I'm going to have my greatest opportunities. But oftentimes when you look at biblical stories, the greatest opportunities are actually in the opposition. It's actually between the promise and the fulfillment of that promise is where you start to see the most significant things that we would look to and say, that is inspiring. That makes him or her a hero and someone that we need to look to and learn from. It's usually what someone does with the opposition more than it is the open door. And I think when we are people that have received a promise, we have been trained to look for open doors. And what a great example you just brought up with Jesus being tempted as well. Like what if Jesus was just looking for open doors? Wouldn't that have looked like one? If he was resting and kind of just looking for an open door, and he said, okay, this is a promise, now I just need to wait for the opening for that would have looked like one maybe, right? But when you start to understand that part of the promise is the journey as well, and we have this value in our church being journey minded, is along the journey as well, then actually you have a more complete picture of what it looks like to actually understand and walk in the whole promise, which isn't just necessarily getting to the destination. It's everything in between as well. So I thought that was a great example.
Yeah, I hear that. The growth, I think we can look back on our lives, the growth that we experience in the waiting.
Yeah.
It's like you can't see it or realize it until later. But then you look back and you said, man, those 2 years waiting sucked. But then you're like, but wow, look how much I grew, or look what I saw God do. And the coolest thing, I would say for sure, and I'm sure you can relate to this, there's nothing like waiting and then seeing God come through. It's the most rewarding, fulfilling, faith-building experience. And
it's all because of him.
Yeah.
And so you don't take any credit for it.
Yeah.
And you're talking about that idea of growth. And one of the things that I mentioned was, I think that sometimes when we are focused on the problems, we can forget that God is working while we're waiting. And you kind of mentioned like you don't see growth happening altogether, but Abraham, the Bible text later on about like how we are the seed of Abraham. And Jesus goes on and he says, the kingdom of God is like a majestic sequoia tree. He doesn't say that, by the way. He says the kingdom of God is like a seed, right? Like a small little seed. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, a seed is unrealized potential. It's at its very beginning stage, but like that's where it begins. And then the growth happens. And I said, if you go to the forest and you stare at a redwood tree for like 2 weeks straight, you probably won't see anything happening to it. But I promise you it's growing. I promise you it's getting stronger. It's maturing. And that's what's happening in our spiritual lives too.
Sure. Like
sometimes we want like the immediate, and we're in this microwave culture where, we expect we can push a few buttons and put in the right ingredients and then out pops, a full meal all cooked and ready. But the truth is that sometimes it's not like that. It's more like a smoker where like, if you've ever smoked meat, it's like it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, to kind of close this out, there is another side of this though, and you touched on it. Okay, so there is the waiting, there is the don't get ahead of God. At the same time, this, and I think people listening and people that have experienced this know that there's like a tension here, because sometimes there's also well, how do I know that door isn't the door I'm supposed to walk through? Like, when does waiting just become being lazy? Mm-hmm. And I appreciated your comment where you said, waiting can be the most courageous thing.
Yes.
On the other hand, I also feel like I have, whether in my own life or encountered other people who, I'm just waiting on God. It's like, get off your butt and do something.
Yes.
Where is the line for you?
I think that if you look at the character of God, it will reveal what God is calling you to do. And so waiting on God does not mean that you are sitting on your hands. It does not mean that you are passive and doing nothing. It's very rare that that's the case, right? Usually waiting still requires movement, right? There's still something happening while you're waiting. As a matter of fact, while you wait is some of the most like crucial moments for how you can be intentional in preparing for the promise. So many times I think people will, I think
people wonder if you like wrote that down.
I didn't.
Like read it. Did you just read a tweet right now?
No.
No. All the letters start with the same letter. Your brain just does that. It's a gift.
But the truth is, and I know what you're talking about, because people will say, you know what, like, I don't want to take that job because I'm just waiting on the Lord. And it's like, and then someone else comes along and they're like, I've got that job. I don't know if you've heard that story of the kind of like, there's this flood and there's this guy on the roof and someone comes by in a boat and he's like, you need some help? And he's like, no, God's got me. He told me he's going to rescue me. And they're like, okay. And then someone comes along with a helicopter and they're like, you want to ride? Like, I can help you. Come on. And he's like, no, God's going to rescue me. And then he drowns and dies and he gets to heaven and he's like, God, why didn't you rescue me? And he's like, I sent you a boat. I sent you a helicopter. Like, what else do you need me to send you?
Right.
Like, there comes a time when we need to have a perspective that maybe isn't just looking for, you want to be careful if you're just looking for open doors, but also like make sure that you're not perceiving every open door as a wrong one simply because it doesn't fit whatever picture you have in your brain, right? Like look at the character of God and you'll understand, how God works in different ways and through other people as well. And then also be diligent. I said I'm not encouraging anyone towards laziness or passivity. I'm saying that the most diligent, the most responsible, and the most courageous thing you can do is wait on the faithfulness of God. And so what waiting on the faithfulness of God might look like is instead of taking that job that starts to put some of the things that God calls you to in question, or makes you like kind of engage in questionable things, or rearranges your priorities so you can no longer prioritize the things that God's calling you to prioritize, or so forth and so on. Those are great indicators that that's not waiting on the faithfulness of God, but trying to take matters into your own hand. On the other hand, if you're like, I need some provision, I need some finances, I need a job, and then God is like bringing into like your life like different opportunities and different things that really fit into the rest of what he's calling you to do, like you need to pray about that, seek God, be diligent in that. And then if you feel like the Lord is leading, even if you feel like the Lord isn't saying no, maybe it's time to start moving. I believe that God honors movement. I really do. I believe that oftentimes God will actually start to let you see some of the fruit as you start to engage your life in obedience.
Yeah.
And I think so many times people are waiting to see the fruit before they're willing to step out in faith. And oftentimes you step out in faith and then, the fruit happens. And
I think that when we say stepping out in faith, it's important to, I think like sometimes, we use words like theologians and things like that. There are times where, thinking through these things deeply is helpful because in theological world, whatever, there's these two sort of big terms that get thrown around.
Faith.
Well, no, I'm sorry. About God's will. And the idea of like theologians call it God's personal, God's universal will. And the reason why we separate those things is because, and it sounds big, but it's really pretty simple.
Yeah.
There are things that God is calling Robert Pedroza to, and there are things that God is just calling Pete Goodman to. That's like a personal between me and Jesus kind of thing.
And there's things
and those are the things that I think it's really like we have to have wisdom and God, where am I at with this? Patience. But then there are things that God is calling all humans to.
Yes.
You don't have to wait for those things.
No.
You don't have to sit and wait on the Lord to decide whether to love your neighbor, whether to be generous, whether to serve. So when people say like, hey, you want to come help us with this event? We need help setting up. I'm just waiting on the Lord.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Yeah.
No. Like you don't need to wait on the Lord.
Well, here's your word.
Yeah. Like the Bible already tells us all the time you don't have to wait on the Lord to forgive and love your enemies. So knowing, like living by faith can be like, there's like almost these two sides to it. Part of living by faith is like in my own personal life with this personal thing, I'm going to trust and wait on the Lord for what he's told me or lead me to. But I'm also going to live by faith by doing all of the things that I know God told me I'm supposed to do just because his Bible says it. And I don't need to wait on the Lord for that. I need to love my wife today because that is the will of God.
Yes.
And so even like, and it gets dicey sometimes, but not as like giving money, like, oh, I'm just waiting on the Lord. You're called to be generous.
Yeah.
I'm waiting on the Lord to decide whether to go to church. No, go to church. That's just be faithful and obey God. But then there are, like specific careers, or should I marry this person? Like those are things that maybe when we're waiting.
Should I move to this place or buy that? Yeah.
It cuts both ways, but. Well, this was great, man. I really appreciate it. I thought you did a great job. It was a really, if anyone's listening or watching Digging Deeper and didn't catch the message, go back and watch it online, risechurch.com, or even right here with your podcasts and YouTube. It was fantastic. And we're going to continue this next week with another story from the Old Testament. Brandon will be, which one are you doing? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I should have known. But
it's going to be a person from the Old
Testament. Yes. So it's going to be good. I'm going to trust that it's going to be good, and check it out.
I'm going to wait on it.
And Dawson, welcome to the team. And we'll get him on a podcast here and let y'all introduce him here in the next few weeks or so.
Oh, man. He didn't know about that. He just got so wide-eyed.
He's like, oh, no. All right, guys. We will see you in the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
See you next time.